Hi everybody, this is Francisco Gil-White for Management of Reality and Arutz Tov in this joint programming that we're doing. And today I have the pleasure of welcoming to this series Alexander Papkov, who is a geopolitical analyst commenting on various topics having to do with Israeli politics and the geopolitics of the Middle East. And he is often seen in the Uri Milstein podcast. So if you later want to hear more about Papkov's views, you can do it. You can certainly find him there. Alexander, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you too for inviting me.
And let's just get started with the first question. So I've been posing this question to several people now, and it is, given that Qatar is the sugar daddy of Hamas, right? They're not only of Hamas. Qatar has become
a middleman.
A middleman, and also, but also financier with their own money for international jihadism, anti-Semitic jihadism, right? They're funding various groups that are interested in the genocidal destruction of the Jewish state. So given that they are doing this, and that in particular they are the sugar daddy of Hamas, is it fair to say that on October 7th, 2023, it was Qatar that attacked Israel? Would you find that a fair statement?
In my opinion, no. The issue is slightly, but not by much, more complicated.
Okay.
In the same way that George Soros appears to be using his own money for his own aims, once you take a slightly deeper look, you're going to find out that he's nothing more than a middleman for what used to be USAID until Trump shut them down. In a similar way, the Qatari government is not an independent actor, although they appear to be or try to appear to be, but actually they are just promoting the foreign policy of, it's hard to pinpoint who, but it's the Anglo-American establishment, let's call them that. And they are allowed to make a lot of money through specific deals, and their profit margin is ensured through OPEC, and then they are told to spend some of that money in specific pathways that are dictated by shadowy elements within the, let's call it, NATO framework.
Interesting. So if I can try to translate what you're saying, correct me if you disagree, it sounds like you're saying that Qatar is actually a tool for laundering the money of the Anglo-American establishment.
Yes.
For their foreign policy purposes.
Yes. When, what would be a good example? Daesh, ISIS. Mm-hmm. The Americans and the British have been deeply embarrassed when pickup trucks with the stickers from Texas used car lots started showing up in Syria, and people started asking questions. How did that get there? Who paid for that? Who signed off on the documents? And the entire chain of supply for this whole thing, because that would directly implicate various high-level people in America and in the UK in treason.
Okay, so let me just make sure we all understand exactly what you're saying, because not everybody in my audience is familiar.
10 years ago what happened.
Right, so this is 10 years ago. ISIS, or Daesh, is a group that aims to create a caliphate in Iraq and Syria. This is what they call themselves. They call themselves the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. That's what ISIS means. And one of their main platforms is the genocidal destruction of the Jewish state. That's certainly one of their goals. The ISIS is the group that was beheading all of these people on absolutely atrocious videos that became very famous all over the world. And what you're telling us is that the U.S. and Britain were embarrassed because American hardware was found to be in the hands of ISIS. So the question, as you were saying, was, well, how did this get into the hands of ISIS? Why is ISIS using American hardware? right?
Yes, so to clarify for people who don't have experience with the supply chains, you need to buy that car in America. You need to transport it from America to some place like Turkey or Jordan or Iraq. You're gonna need to move that from the port close to the border. You're gonna need that vehicle to cross the border, and throughout all that time you need to pay for fuel, for trucking, for employee expenses. So that's a lot of checks that somebody signed with taxpayer dollars.
Also,
That's
you
a
need
crime.
to, and you also need to clear several checkpoints by various functionaries and officials along the way who have to okay the passage of this hardware.
Yeah, at some point it's gonna move from legal transport to illegal smuggling, but yes, there will be a lot of people along the way that need to be paid with taxpayer money to supply terrorist organizations with weapons of war.
Which taxpayers are you referring to?
Well, the most obvious one is the Americans, but it'll probably be the British. You have EU involvement, a lot of elements. Once Elon Musk started to check in the books, in only the American part of USAID, he hasn't reached the Pentagon yet, or the CIA, but you're gonna find a lot of money is being thoroughly mixed, so that nobody has, not nobody, but governments don't like to take responsibility for things, so they usually mix money. So, for example, the support of the moderate rebels in Syria, you see some sort of collaboration between American, British, French, Dutch, German. Anybody was stupid enough to send them money, and then they pool all that money and use it to buy the Toyota Hilux in as many as they can get and send them over.
Okay, but it's worse than just cars, right? Because I have an investigation that I will send you later on the origin of ISIS. And what we've documented is that the ISIS actually came out of the U.S. military prison system in Iraq.
Obviously.
Right? So they had these giant military prisons that were operating for 5 years. And according to the U.S. general who was running the prison system, it functioned as a jihadi university. He used that phrase. He said, my prison system is a jihadi university. Why? Because the U.S. authorities had allowed the jihadists inside the jail to control the social life of the jail. And then anyone who was not in that prison already in the jihadi ideology and participating as a jihadi terrorist, those people were forced to join, they were indoctrinated, they were recruited, and then when the 5 years that those prisons were operating in Iraq, these people were just let go. And ISIS came out of that, right? All of the main commanders, including al-Baghdadi, they all came out of the U.S. prison system where they were allowed to recruit. And then the weapons, as you were pointing out, the supposedly democratic forces in Syria, which received weapons through Turkey and through Qatar and Saudi Arabia, etc., allied with the U.S. because this was a conduit for U.S. weapons to the so-called Free Syrian Army and so forth. These people got American weapons and American training in Turkey, and then most of them simply joined ISIS. It's not just Toyotas and cars that ISIS is driving. In fact, they have American weapons and American training. And it sounds to me like you are saying that this is all deliberate. Do you agree with that?
Yes, because the best kind of opposition is a position that you can control, and you can. It has always been a policy of the, let's call it the British Crown, to specify which region in the world should be in upheaval right now and which region should be calm. Because the economic foundation of, let's call it the Anglo-American Empire, is international trade. And they choose which areas have conflict And through that conflict, they can both reduce trade in the area and, on the other hand, lower the cost of raw materials such as oil. Because if if an organization like ISIS controls oil wells, they will sell that oil at below market prices, giving other countries like Israel the opportunity to buy that oil and resell it at market price, producing a large profit. Through various admissions in Israeli newspapers, we used similar tricks to smuggle oil out of what is called Kurdistan into our facilities in Haifa and resell it on the market for a massive profit.
So, but are you saying that the U.S. is arming the people who want to destroy Israeli Jews in genocide to get a better price of oil? Is that really what you're saying?
Let's give a far less controversial example. Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was operating in World War II with direct assistance by OSS agents on the ground. When the war was over and he declared independence of Vietnam, he directly quoted from the U.S. Declaration of Independence. He literally quoted the first two paragraphs. We believe these truths to be self-evident and all that thing. And later, he was turned from somebody who worked for the American intelligence network into the alleged greatest enemy that the U.S. spent untold trillions and tens of thousands of lives to fight him.
Okay.
When all he asked was basic diplomatic relations. So they created an enemy and then used him to fulfill their economic goals of empowering the military-industrial complex. In a similar fashion, the United States, what I think happened, created ISIS to then fight against ISIS, to then build several military air bases within northern Syria or in the border region between Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. They could not have had that real estate unless there was an international call for an intervention within Syria and a group that they appear to have legitimacy to fight against with boots on the ground. So they wanted, the initial objective, I think, of the Americans was, we want to have military air bases in northern Syria. How do we create them? We create the most awful terror group that we can. We arm them to take over that territory, and then we arm opposition to them to take back that territory. And it stays in internationally unrecognized hands, and within that gray area, we can build our air base. That's the four-step plan.
Within a model like this, how do you explain the attack of October 7th, 2023? Because if your argument is, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that your argument there would be that there is some Machiavellian purpose, some Machiavellian goal that then the U.S. bosses would have for October 7th, because in Qatar we have what seems to be the most intimate ally of the U.S. bosses. They have their most important military base in Qatar, in all of the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia. It's the headquarters for Central Command, CENTCOM. It's the Al Udeid base in Qatar.
Yes.
And it seems to me that the presence of that base in Qatar is a shield for the Qatari bosses. In other words, the fact that the Americans have their CENTCOM's headquarters in Qatar means that nobody can attack Qatar, certainly not Israel. So in a sense, it seems fair to say that on October 7th, Qatar attacked Israel behind an American shield. And then that shield made it impossible for Israel to defend itself from its true enemy, from the biggest enemy, which is Qatar, which can, if Hamas is destroyed, Qatar can simply finance the creation of a new terrorist enemy. So what Israel would need to do, it seems to me, to really defend itself is attack Qatar. But it can't do that because there's an American base there. So it seems to me that one interpretation here is that Israel got attacked by the U.S. on October 7th, 2023. And so, according to your model, what would be the goal of the American bosses in attacking Israel via Qatar and Hamas?
Guessing goals is slightly more difficult because we are dealing on several levels with people who are, the word irrational is incorrect. I would say that they are religious, and their religion is hard to understand. But
who are we talking about right now?
The people who told Qatar to finance Hamas.
Okay. So you, in your model, those would be people in the American power structure?
Yes.
Okay.
In the international power structure, to be more precise.
Which is dominated by the U.S. bosses,
yes,
isn't
it? The U.S. is more of the main financial source, but it's not the main ideological source, let's call it that way.
Okay.
The reasoning behind the October 7th attack, you need to separate two scenarios. One is that you believe the version that they were planning on Hamas performing a limited attack, which got out of control by popular support in Gaza to expand the attack into unplanned phases. And the other that they planned a much more serious blow to Israel that was foiled by local forces.
Which one do you prefer?
I think that they were planning on the limited attack based on plans that were leaked. Not that I trust the leakers of these plans, but Hamas, even the limited military operation that they were planning, they failed to execute. They did not have the, let's call it, military skill to execute a complex maneuver.
Okay.
Had they managed that, Israel would have been in far more serious trouble if they took over Hatzerim air base or managed to hold hostage 10,000 people instead of a few hundred. That would have been a far more serious scenario, and Hamas was foiled. Now, the question, who wanted that, you can approach it from several angles. The obvious one would be the leftists who wanted to force Israel into concessions of some sort, whether it's a two-state solution, a three-state solution, or just weakening Israel and forcing an economic crisis or mass immigration or something. The deeper level is that maybe they were interested in Israel over-retaliating and doing what Trump proposed a few weeks ago of completely conquering Gaza, expelling the jihadi supporters out of it, and resettling it as a Jewish settlement, and finally closing the Gaza issue. You could have a further interest of somebody who was interested in destabilizing all of the Sinai, because outside of the lights of media cameras and international attention, in the last 10-15 years, the insurgency against the Egyptian army in the Sinai was far more severe than the battles between the US Army and the Taliban ever was. They have more casualties, they use more hardware, but because it's in the middle of the desert and nobody filmed it, then both sides pretend it didn't happen. But in my opinion, had all of these tens of thousands of Hamas militants been one way or another expelled into the Sinai, they could have established some sort of Bedouinistan there and have access to the Suez Canal and threaten the Egyptian government stability and cause all sorts of problems. And you always have scenario number 4, that they just wanted to start a conflict that will drain US military resources so that it cannot respond to another conflict like in Ukraine or in Taiwan or somewhere else.
Okay, well, none of these hypotheses seems to me is the obvious simple-minded hypothesis. So let me put that on the table, and you tell me whether you think this is another hypothesis that we should consider, or whether you think it shouldn't be considered, and why. It seems to me the simple-minded hypothesis, when you find U.S. bosses collaborating or even pushing jihadi forces to launch an attack on Israel, which seems to be what happened here, and let me tell you why I think this is the proper way to describe it, is that Qatar is impossible to defend. Qatar is a tiny little peninsula of sand, entirely flat. It can only be defended if it has a U.S. military base there. If it didn't have that, Saudi Arabia, Iran, almost any regional power around Qatar would have conquered it a long time ago. So, because it has the largest gas reserves in the world, and it's obviously a succulent prize for any regional power. So, given that Qatar cannot survive as an independent state without that U.S. military base, it seems to me that the U.S. bosses have the power to direct Qatari foreign policy. Yes. All they have to do is tell Qatar what to do, and Qatar has to jump. So if Qatar is free to finance international jihadism, and in particular to build Gaza into a Hamas terror structure, which is what they did with their money, then it seems to me the logical inference is that this is all the policy of the U.S. bosses, because they could change it in a second. I asked Mordechai Kedar yesterday, how long would, in his learned opinion, would it take for the Americans to conquer Qatar from Al Udeid base? How long would it take? And he said, well, maybe 2 hours. And then he ended up saying, well, maybe within an hour. Okay, so it is so easy for the U.S. to take over Qatar that we must consider it demonstrated, I think, simply by this analysis, that whatever Qatar does is U.S. policy, because they could change it in a second with almost no effort or cost, right? So if that's our model, if our model is that Qatari policy has to be interpreted as U.S. policy, then it seems to me that the simple-minded hypothesis about what they're trying to do, since they're collaborating and even maybe directing the policy of Qatar, is that given that Qatar is financing movements that have as their sacred goal the extermination of the Israeli Jews, shouldn't we put on the table as the first hypothesis that this is also the goal of the U.S. bosses? Why not?
Can we discuss on this channel the Kalergi Plan or State Department Memorandum 200?
I have been given zero editorial line, so you can feel free to say whatever's on your mind.
Let's go with the easier thing to check. State Department Memorandum 200 was Henry Kissinger, back when he was the National Security Advisor, drafted this memorandum that one of the main threats to American national security would be the economic development of the impoverished areas such as Africa and the Middle East. And so he dictated that it would be in the geopolitical interests of the United States and of Western Europe to maintain areas of conflict throughout the world, to prevent areas of stability forming within Africa and the Middle East that would prosper economically and become economic competitors to the Western supremacy at the time. You have a nice example in Dubai, which is stable, both economically and politically, and managed to reach never before seen in the Muslim world peaks of technological development, economic development. They became a surname for, they became the competitor of Switzerland in many ways. And that was just one example of one place that managed to achieve stability. What if they had several of these in Qatar, in Kuwait, in even in Iraq? They could have had that. Had there not been conflicts like the Iran-Iraq war, had they not have to fight jihadist movements, in almost every country, in every Muslim country that you look at, you have some sort of jihadist insurgency, and you have a government fighting against the jihadist insurgency, and it would be the economic interests of the United States to promote that jihadist insurgency and then sell the solution to the problem to the local government to make sure that both of them are kept within some sort of balance and not achieving actual peace and stability.
Okay, but I perceive a contradiction, so allow me to push back on your model a little bit. So the contradiction I perceive is that U.S. policy does not appear to be to foment conflict. It appears to be to foment pro-jihadism. In other words, the countries that are already run by jihadi governments, the U.S. bosses protect. So they protect Saudi Arabia, they protect Qatar, they protect Emirates, they protect Bahrain. In other words, any country that has a stable jihadi government, they like and they protect. And if it doesn't have a stable jihadi government, then they support jihadi insurgencies there. So they're not promoting conflict, they're promoting jihadism. If jihadism is in power, they like it to be stable. If jihadism is not in power, then they promote jihadi insurgency. Would you agree with that?
Exactly. It's how would we define it? There's linear thinking and then there's differential thinking. What you're describing, they control both the inflow and the outflow of jihadist activity within areas. If there is not enough jihadist activity in some areas, like Libya, who started to become surprisingly stable, even though it has 3 different governments, that they started flowing jihadists out of Syria into Libya, trying to destabilize it. And if you have a place that is already destabilized, like Syria or now Sudan, then they make outflows of the jihadists into other areas. The most stunning example, I think, would be in the 90s when they had the famous Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia, and then they started through hard to explain movements, move these jihadists out of Somalia and into former Yugoslavia to start up a jihadist movement there. So
you're still talking about the U.S. bosses.
I'm talking about the people who make foreign policy choices in the United States.
That's who I mean.
I'm not sure I would call them U.S. bosses because their interests are not aligned with the national interest of the United States.
Oh, well,
they
only
not appear to be.
Okay, so they're not U.S. patriots.
Yes.
But they are the bosses. They make the state level decisions. So they're the bosses. Okay. So these, it seems to me like you agree with me then that what is consistent in U.S. foreign policy is not the creation of conflict or the sabotaging of economic development in the Middle East, because they're very happy for stable jihadi states to become rich. They've protected the wealth production in Saudi Arabia and in Qatar and in Emirates, in Kuwait. All of the Muslim countries that have stable jihadi governments, they're very happy for those to become rich. And they don't promote conflict there. To the contrary, they launched a war to defend Kuwait. Right? So not Kuwait, but the Kuwaiti ruling elite, right? The Kuwaiti regime. So it seems to me that what is consistent is not this Kissinger memorandum. It's not, what they do is not consistent with the Kissinger memorandum. They're not destabilizing everybody or preventing everybody from becoming rich in the Middle East. They are destroying non-jihadi regimes and protecting jihadi regimes. That's what's consistent.
Because they have a larger overall plan to have these jihadi regimes fight each other in the long run. You gave the example of Qatar. So Qatar regularly sends mercenaries to various hotspots like Libya, like Yemen. They have a very under the radar but noticeable presence of mostly special forces, logistics units, specialized weapons, and you end up with the situations like the Houthis, who on the one hand, not everybody has shoes, and on the other hand, they have very advanced missile systems which appear to be of Iranian origin, but if you check the financial trail, it does go through Qatar. And the deeper policy is to There's the Kissinger Memorandum, and the higher level is the Brzezinski book.
Brzezinski, yeah.
What's his name? The something with the chessboard.
Zbigniew, the chessboard. Yeah.
Yes. So he advocated in the 80s for a policy of empowering Iran to become a threat on the Sunni nations and forcing the Sunni nations to seek higher levels of U.S. protection from Iranian expansion.
Okay, but I don't. My personal view is we shouldn't pay any attention to what these U.S. bosses say in public, because Brzezinski and these other guys, they're not interested in informing the public about what they really want to do. I think when they speak in public, what they're doing is they're trying to produce a political effect. So since they obviously benefit from manipulating us, I think we should consider that the information value of their public statements is zero, and we should look only at the consequences of their policies when they spend billions of dollars. That's an honest signal of what they really care about. And when we look at that, we see that they are always propping up the jihadis, whether they are Shiite jihadis, as in Iran-Contra, where they received several $1 billion in armament sent secretly by the Reagan administration, right? Or they are openly funding jihadis who are officially allied with them, like Qatar, like Saudi Arabia, like Kuwait. But what is consistent is the propping up and protection of jihadi regimes. So I think the simple-minded policy is that they like jihadism. And jihadis want to exterminate the Israeli Jews. So again, I ask you, why can't we put on the table the hypothesis that the U.S. bosses want to repeat the Shoah in Israel? Because you see, when you look at the broad spectrum of geopolitical history, there are two things that I find very interesting, and I'd like you to react. One is that U.S. bosses have a history. The U.S. bosses have an almost dynastic history, because the people running the United States in the first half of the 20th century happen to have been eugenicists. Yes. This has been documented with great detail by historian Edwin Black, who's the great historian of eugenics. And what he finds is that the biggest industrialists in the Anglo-American aristocracy, the Anglo-American power elite, they are real aristocrats in Great Britain and functionally aristocrats in the United States. These people were all ideologues of the eugenics movement. And the eugenics movement is the movement that produced German Nazism. And Edwin Black can show that giant amounts of money, diplomatic support, everything were flowing from the United States and Great Britain, from these great industrialists and the aristocrats in Great Britain, to the German eugenics movement that became German Nazism, right?
Yes.
And they were even assisting the German Nazis during the war after Pearl Harbor, right? So you have a eugenic ruling elite in the United States. They were never removed from power. They stayed in power. And so you would expect, since they are pro-Nazi and therefore anti-Jewish, because we also have all this evidence about what happened during the war. It's very famous now, at least in people who pay attention into what we've learned about the war. In those circles, it's very famous now that the Allies, the Western Allies in World War II, refused to bomb the death camps or even the railroads leading to the death camps. They protected the extermination process. So, given that those people were not removed from power, and given that they returned the Nazis to power in Germany, this is also relatively famous for some of us. It's the historian Christopher Simpson documented that after World War II, the CIA was created by absorbing tens of thousands of Nazi war criminals that formed part of Reinhard Gehlen's organization.
The Odessa Network. Yes.
No. The Odessa Network was
one of the sections that was responsible for the more international levels. Exactly. By the way, this channel should invest some resources in making a show on the amount of Nazis that were sent as delegates to Iran in the 50s to prop up their industry, and how these industries became the Iranian military industry of today. You would find quite a lot of names there.
Very interesting. And who sent those Nazis to Iran?
The same people who were running Western Germany at the time.
Okay.
The Allies.
Exactly. And back to the Gehlen organization. So the CIA was created from Reinhard Gehlen's Nazis. Gehlen had been the chief intelligence officer, General Reinhard Gehlen had been the chief intelligence officer of Fremde Heer Ost, which was Hitler's armies, foreign armies east. And he put together the entire intelligence infrastructure of Adolf Hitler in Eastern Europe for the US bosses. This is what became the CIA. We're talking about at least tens of thousands of Nazi war criminals with the blood of millions of people on their hands. And in 1956, this is all public now. In 1956, the CIA told the West German government that the Gehlen org and Reinhard Gehlen himself were now going to become the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, I can't pronounce it, I'm sorry, the BND, which is West Germany's equivalent of the CIA, right? So they returned the Nazis to clandestine power in Germany. All right, so all of this is evidence that the same eugenicists running the US before the war were the eugenicists running the US after the war. And therefore, we should expect that post-war US policy would be figuring out how to kill the Jews in Israel. I mean, they figured out how to kill the Jews in Europe. They used the Nazis to kill the Jews in Europe. You should expect them in the post-war to be finding ways to kill the Jews in Israel, and once again to make it seem as though they had nothing to do with it. And the stuff that we've been summarizing, you and I, the entire slant of U.S. policy in the Middle East and more generally seems to be to support jihadism in any of its forms. If they're already in power, to protect them. If they're not in power, to support them so they can destabilize regimes and take them over. They're intimately allied with Qatar, which is the biggest financier of jihadi terrorism. And Qatar's baby is Hamas, which attacked Israel on October 7th. Now, the U.S. could have taken over Qatar in under an hour, according to Kedar, if they were upset by what happened on the 7th of October. But clearly they're not very upset because they've been sabotaging Israeli defense from October 8th forward, right?
Yes.
And they were doing that before. I mean, the U.S. government released, a few months before the October 7th attack, they had released something like $6 billion for Iran, and after the October 7th attack, they started sending money to Hamas. So it seems to me the general picture, if we see the same eugenicists who produced German Nazism in the post-war supporting jihadism, and remembering that there was a very strong alliance between the German Nazis and the jihadis during World War II, why shouldn't the interpretation be that U.S. bosses are trying to kill the Jews again?
It is both correct and immaterial because let's go back to the other point I asked if you want to mention, the Kalergi plan. It is unfathomable for people who have not researched the issue, but the main supporters of communism are the billionaires, because when you have some sort of economic system that is based on actual money, you have a chance to lose it. But if the only parameter of whether or not you have property is your standing within the one political party, you can never run out of money. You can always be on the what we have in Israel called budgetary pensions. And when you're a billionaire and you own assets, the state owns the assets, and you ensure through your power within the party that you keep control of them through the political establishment. That is So
it's not technically your money, but you spend it as if it were.
Yes, that is the essence of fascism. Fascism is just corporatism,
yes,
where the supposed strong leader is just the head of a council that is composed of the biggest corporations in the country. And the deeper issue is the Kalergi plan. What is their objective? They want to...
Tell us what is this plan exactly?
There was this Kalergi, I don't remember, he has a long name. He was half Austrian, half Japanese, and obviously people were racist towards him in Central Europe. So he composed a plan. It came up after all of these ethnic rivalries after World War I, between World War I and World War II. And he said that the way to force Europe into peace through total peace, and total peace can be only enforced by the world government, is to remove the national identity of everyone in Europe. And the way to do that he proposed, is to flood Europe with hundreds of millions of immigrants from Africa, Asia, and from anywhere else, so that after several generations, people will not have a national identity. And these jihadist forces are simply a militant wing of the broader movement that we saw very well Germany, the Scandinavians, and especially France, now Britain too, massively supporting, at the expense of their own taxpayers, bring as many immigrants from Asia and Africa into their countries that they can. And supporting the jihadist movements is just a way to funnel the money, because the how to explain it? The smuggling network that can put the weapons from, like I said, the Toyota Hilux, move it from Texas into Western Iraq, is the same network that can smuggle a jihadist from Western Iraq into Texas. And they create these networks, these logistical networks, to work in both directions. And at a certain point, the weapons from Western Iraq will come back to Texas, and the jihadi will obviously use that weapon to create some sort of attack. And their deeper plan, especially we see it now in Europe, is to have all of these minor smuggling networks merge into larger organizations through their religion. And their ultimate goal, there is only two exit paths out of the situation that they already created. Because the critical mass of 10-20% Muslim people within Europe is already formed. Either the Europeans, the native Europeans, will have to reopen concentration camps for these Muslims who have been there 3, 4, 5 generations, and that way the eugenicists win, because they have the excuse and the support of the public to restart the death camps. Or the jihadists win, and then the jihadis open their own Muslim concentration camps against the kuffar, the unbelievers, and the eugenicists win again. They don't care if the rulers of Europe will be the Muslims or the local British, French, Dutch. They want the death camps back. And the way they get their death camps, either way, they plan to get them in the long run, unless countries like Denmark and Sweden got spooked early enough that they started mass deportation. But this mass deportation will not help them, because the critical mass of Muslim minorities is already present within the country.
Okay, so this is remarkably similar to my own model. So
yes.
you're
it's
saying
the same eugenicists that they planned both this and that, and when they saw the Kalergi plan, they started throwing money into it.
Right.
And we saw the expansion mostly in the last 2 decades.
Okay, so if I may summarize or just reinterpret in my own words what you're saying, it appears that your model is that the Western bosses are trying to destroy the democratic experiment of the West, the modern democratic experiment.
Yes.
And so they are giving Westerners a choice between 2 different kinds of fascism. So we go back to traditional Western fascism, or we go forward into jihadi fascism.
Exactly.
But either way, what they want is fascism. They want democracy destroyed and totalitarianism imposed.
Exactly.
But I would challenge just one aspect of what you said, because I don't think it's immaterial that they have the intention of destroying the Jewish people. I think that's strategic, because I happen to think that the Jewish people are key in Western civilization. Yes. We wouldn't have a democratic experiment if it weren't for the influence of Jewish ethics on Western civilization. So it seems to me that it's not immaterial, it's strategic. You guys are very important. And the importance that you have for them, for the bosses, is really dramatically exposed, I think, when you look at the Oslo process. Because the Oslo process has been the most important policy of the US bosses towards Israel of the last half century. And what did they do with the Oslo process? I don't know if you're aware of this, and if you're not, I already sent you the article where I document it. But this organization that they introduced into Israel with the Oslo process, and not just into Israel, but into militarily strategic territory of the Jewish state, because that's what Judea, Samaria, and Gaza are.
Yeah, the high ground.
Exactly, the high ground and a ground that is next to Egypt, which is a mortal enemy of Israel, right? So it's all strategic. This organization that they brought into strategic territory is the creator of jihadi Iran. So normally, the PLO Fatah, or what we now call the Palestinian Authority, is described as a secular group, as a leftist group, right? I know, well, you should laugh, of course.
They had a lot of KGB agents in there, yes.
Well, but
they speak Russian better than me.
Well, but I think the KGB aspect of it has been overly emphasized, because it wasn't the KGB that brought them into Israel, it was the U.S. bosses. They set up the Oslo process, and they pushed for the Oslo process to go forward every single time, whether they're Democratic or Republican presidents. So, and this detail, it's not a detail, it's a crucial point that I was telling you about, is that PLO Fatah trained and armed Ayatollah Khomeini's guerrillas in the 1970s in Lebanon. And then when the Iranian Revolution triumphed, they were invited over to Tehran to celebrate with Khomeini the revolution. And PLO Fatah, Arafat, Abbas, and some other guys, they created Iran's terrorist infrastructure, which is dedicated to destroying the Israeli Jews. So, and of course, the U.S. intelligence had to know all of this, because I know it, because I found an article from the New York Times, and then I found many other articles published in 1979, where it was explained on the front page of the New York Times that PLO Fatah had created Ayatollah Khomeini and his terror infrastructure. So this was explained on the front page of the New York Times in 1979 when the revolution happened. And it stands to reason, therefore, that the U.S. bosses did all of this knowing that they were bringing jihadis interested in the destruction of the Jewish people into militarily strategic territory of the Jewish state. It was an attack on Israel. So I think, I really think we should not say that this is immaterial. I think it's central. I think it's strategic. And I think that's the reason that so much attention is paid all the time to the Jewish state, and why so much policy is invented and organized to undermine the security of the Jewish state, because they understand that if you get rid of the Jewish people, you can collapse the entire West into totalitarianism. Yes. And they already did it in World War II. They killed the European Jews and they enslaved the Europeans. And now they're going to try to kill the Jews again, I think, and enslave all of us, all Westerners. What do you think about that?
Let's separate it in 2 points. The first, if you try to take the essence of the Jewish religion, the obvious would be the 10th Commandments, which would be the most important one. I think the first one. And a lot of people seem to not be able to quote it exactly. So
that's also true. Yeah.
You can check in your Bible. I, JJ, your God, is the one who removed you from the land of Egypt, from a house of slaves. So what does it mean? Egypt, until the stupid communists built that giant dam that blocked the Nile, was the most fertile place on the planet. It was the easiest place to live in, to grow food, to have a family, all that. But it was a house of slaves. And God chose for you, for the Jewish person, to remove you out of there. So we often have this balance between liberty and safety. God chose for us to prefer liberty over safety. And that runs against the totalitarian model, because they always sell you the safety. That's what all the dictators promise. And the safest place to be is inside a prison cell.
Right. So one way to say this is that the totalitarian strategy is always to produce danger.
Yes.
They produce danger so that you will run to them for safety.
Yes.
And the recipe for safety is they take all of your freedoms away.
Yes.
Right? So they create the danger so that they can take your rights and your freedoms away.
Yes.
And the reason that I've been saying this all the time, I think we're in very close agreement, you and I, because what I've been saying for a long time is exactly what you said. The Jewish civilization was born in a slave revolt. Jewish law was born in a slave revolt. And what we Westerners have learned over the centuries from the Jewish people is how to fight for freedom.
Yes.
How to fight for our individual rights and to liberate ourselves from oppressive government. So I think the totalitarians of other centuries and the totalitarians of this century have always understood that if they want to enslave all of us, all Westerners, they have to start by destroying the Jewish people.
Yes, because the Jewish people usually are the ones that lead opposition to enslavement and lead human rights. And I think the big conflict that we have with the West right now, that when they see these groups that advocate for equal rights or liberty or some sort, they always seem to have Jews within their leadership structure. And I think the most cruel part of what the, let's call it, the American bosses are doing is that they specifically choose people of Jewish ethnicity that are corruptible, and then use them to promote ideals that are the opposite of liberty under the guise of liberty. And then you have people who oppose the values that these specific individuals show, and they try to represent that as if they represent the Jewish people. They make a lot of noises that George Soros is Jewish, and you can give them a list of 200 organizations that he's personally funding that are day and night trying to destroy the Israeli state and destroy the Jewish religion and destroy the Jewish people. But they'll claim that he's the Jew and he represents the Jewish people.
Right.
And they that way promote anti-Semitism among people who were neutral, or at least didn't have a solid opinion on the matter. And they show them a creature like George Soros or, I don't know, Rosa Luxemburg as a representative of the Jewish people instead of being a complete fringe creature.
Alexander, I have to close the show. I'm being told that we're running out of time. This has been very interesting. I hope it's the first conversation of many. I want to ask you one last question, simple yes or no answer. And then we can discuss this more in a future encounter. Would it be fair to consider that some of those corruptible Jewish leaders are among the Israeli bosses? Yes or no?
Very much yes.
Thank you. Okay, so we will do this again soon. Thank you very much for joining us, Alexander. This is Francisco Gil-White for Management of Reality and Awutz Tov in our joint program series. I hope to see you all again. And in the meantime, if you want to look at our content, you can find it at managementofreality.com or franciscogilwhite.com. Both addresses take you to the same place, and you will find all kinds of content there, from videos, articles, books, and so forth, not only focused on the situation in Israel, but on the larger geopolitical situation and the crisis of the West. Thank you very much.